Well, good evening, everybody, and it's great to see so many people joining us live tonight. And if you're watching the session recorded, you're very welcome. Welcome to the Tennis Parents community. And if you haven't heard of the group before, do look us up on Facebook. We're a group who join together the parents of tennis players in Great Britain and help them to help each other, and really a peer-to-peer support group rather than ask the expert. But we also host live Q&As. And I'm really delighted tonight to welcome you to our latest Q&A with Huw Phillips. Now, there's a technical side to tennis equipment that's always completely baffled me, even as a player myself. And so when Hugh agreed to join us for this evening's Q&A to share his expertise, I knew that we were in for a real treat. He's a professional racket technician of the highest caliber, working in a world where small but significant improvements can lead to monumental gains. He customized the rackets used by Emma Raducanu to win the US Open, and we're going to learn what that even means, to be honest. He strung the last racket used by Roger Federer in his career. What a great claim to fame. And on that same day, he also strung rackets for Nadal, Murray, and Djokovic. He's going to be teaching us tonight about rackets, grips, strings, tension, how to make decisions based on age, physicality, maturation, technical style, the ball that you're using, and more. And all this in order to perform at the highest level, but also to avoid injury in the short and the longer term. Now, as usual, we aren't paying Hugh to give up his time this evening. He's just keen to share his knowledge, and we're very grateful for that. So, Hugh, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and welcome to the Tennis Parents community.
Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. And we always start by asking our guests the first question, just to get you settled in a bit and let us get to know you a bit better, perhaps. Could you tell us about your own childhood in tennis and how your parents supported you?
Well, yeah, I wasn't anything sort of special as a player. I sort of played sort of sort of county level tennis when I was a kid, but nothing more than that really. However, I was sort of, as probably most people here would testify to, costing my parents a small fortune in racket strings, particularly where we lived, where there was only one sort of place you could get it done expensively. And it sort of culminated in a point when I was about 17 or something, playing in the county championships. I snapped three strings in 3 rackets in one set. And I remember it because it was the county semi-final and I'd never beaten the chap before, and I was winning. Unfortunately, subsequently lost because the barman at the venue we were playing at had to go and get me a racket out of the men's changing rooms that had just been left in lost property. So that's basically, after that my parents said, for your 18th birthday, you would like a stringing machine and to learn how to string your own rackets, wouldn't you? Because it was, costing £30 a pop at the time, I think.
Wow. Yeah.
But this is in, dare I say it, the mid-90s. So that's how it sort of started. Just a little relatively cheap drop weight machine, just stringing for myself. Shortly after that, went to university, carried on stringing my own, stringing for other people at university, just make some sort of beer money, so officially to help my studies, but beer money. So carried on for that. Carried on playing tennis through university, carried on after playing club matches and things like this. Then sort of around about the age of 30, decided to take stringing. It'd always been quite a serious hobby of mine. I'd always been very interested in it as well, all the technicalities, customization, things like that, and trying different strings, different rackets. And around about the age of 30, decided to take it a little bit more seriously, get myself undertake qualifications with a view then to perhaps, if the opportunities presented themselves, becoming a tournament stringer. So fast forward a few years after that, I'd set up my own business and started stringing on tour, and I've now been very lucky and privileged to sort of be stringing for the Wimbledon team since 2016. Managed to do in 22, I've done Davis Cup, I've done Billie Jean King Cup, several ATP WTA events, and one of the highlights was the Laver Cup when it was in London in 2022. And like many people, Federer is one of my idols. Never thought I'd get to string his racket because he had a private stringer all through his career, but then managed to not only string his at the Laver Cup, but also, as you said earlier, the big four all in one day. And never thought I'd string for all of them, and then they all came like buses in one day. So
So really,
and
there's
then
not many people who've even strung Roger Federer's racket, let alone all of the.
not many. And no, it was quite. It was. I must admit, it was quite an emotional evening because where we were, the court side, we were literally court side. So when all that, I don't know if everyone watched it, was on the telly. We were literally just able to walk out from the machines, and we were literally by the court when they were doing all the,
Well, mostly
fanfare
crying,
for the doubles.
weren't they?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was just super emotional, and yeah, that must have been an amazing thing to be part of. But I do want to ask you, do you string your mother's rackets for free? Just a little question there from me. No personal connection, obviously.
Yes is the official answer to that, I think. So
Good. I'll be sharing that with my son. So, how do you feel when someone smashes a racket that you've strung, Hugh?
um bizarre, strangely, I've got to be honest, whether I don't condone the smashing of rackets, I'm not necessarily anti. It doesn't necessarily bother me if they smash one I've strung, because most of the players, they generally have 6 or 7 in their bag anyway, so they'll just pick up another one. So it doesn't really
They're not precious to you. Once you've strung them, they're just out there for whatever purpose.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, without sounding silly about it, but we string so many at these tournaments, it's sort of you can't. There's certain players you get emotional attachments to, obviously through the tournament, but you've got to be sort of professional, and you just churn out the same job each time on the rackets what they want. So you have to be slightly detached from it. You can't get too invested in what they're on what they're doing with their rackets. It's up to them at the end of the day.
No, of course. No, that's a good answer, and I'm glad you don't get upset by that. It would be quite hard to watch, I'd imagine. Now, tonight we're going to talk about all kinds of things to do with rackets and stringing and so forth. I'd encourage anybody who's on the call to participate. I know parents are quite a shy lot, and once again, I've only got a couple of people who've put a question in advance who'd like to ask it themselves, and we're not sure if they're on the call even yet, so we'll watch out for that as we get to it. But do put anything you'd like to say in the chat as well. Use the chat, and I'll try and keep an eye on that, as will Hugh perhaps. But we'll start first of all. We're going to cover a lot, and much of it will be interrelated, I'm sure. But should we start by talking about racket frames, if you don't mind, Hugh? There are so many brands on the market promising different benefits. What do parents need to know in order to make the best choice for their child when they first start to play tennis?
Well, if they're just starting out, rackets for youngsters are generally age appropriate, so they come in different sizes, starting for the very small sort of 17-inch rackets, generally go up in 2-inch increments, so 17, 19, 21, 23, 25. You can then get 26, just to confuse that slightly. And then adult rackets are 27-inch, the regular tennis rackets. So basically, it's hard to show on here, but the rule of thumb, your coach at your club should be able to advise on the right length racket for them. Or if you go to your local shop that sells rackets, they should also be able to advise. Basically, if they're standing straight, they should be able to hold the racket in their arm down to their side, and the head should just touch the floor. That's the right size racket for them. So the manufacturers they're quite helpful, all of them pretty much, on the little placards you get on the string bed. They generally, something like Wilson, for example, they'll put it's a 19-inch racket. It's generally meant for this age.
Can
But
you just
obviously,
what you said, the string bed there? Whereabouts is that?
sorry, the strings. So, you get those little pieces of cardboard that are generally sort of
Ah,
popped
right.
onto the strings when you buy a new racket. If
Okay.
you look on there, it'll generally say 19-inch racket. This is meant for whatever age, and it's normally a couple of years age band. What I would say though, it's get it sort of, to sound like a golfing term, get it fitted by the coach or the shop, because not every child falls into those sort of bands. Some might be taller, some might be smaller. But until they're sort of approaching, 14, 15, where they'd be looking for a full size 27-inch racket, you know, they're a good guide.
Okay, and so you're talking age there, but presumably when you mentioned hanging the racket down by your side, that's also to do with height.
Yes, it's generally for the little ones. It's generally height dependent. So so that's what I was saying. Take the guides that they put on the frames as a guide, just that, and just basically have them rack it down to the side, arms straight down, and if they're holding it by the handle, it should, if it's the right size, it'll just be touching the floor, the tip of the racket, and then that's the right size for them.
Okay, and so if we think now about the brands, I mean, obviously there's many different tennis racket brands, and we see the professionals using different ones from sponsors and so forth. And we'll come on to talk a bit more about the professional customization later on. But can you give us a bit of an overview about the different brands? Because, for example, someone said that their 9-year-old is doing okay with a 26-inch racket, but should they consider changing the brand in case it improves their game? What would you say about the different brands?
In terms of improving your game, the brand won't have that much of an impact. The brands, you've got the big three brands, which are Wilson Head, Babolat. Sort of just behind them, then you've got Yonex, Dunlop, Technofiber rackets. They all make very, very good rackets across the range. So they'll all make the top end expensive rackets. They all pretty much all make the cheaper end junior rackets as well. If you get any of the recognized brands, they're all good rackets. When you actually get to the thing that I would recommend, the brand is not necessarily going to change your game. However, a different racket may help, but you should try the racket. But it's not because a Wilson is not going to make you hit a forehand better than a head racket. However, that particular Wilson model that you're trying might be better suited to your game than another racket. So it's a case of trying the different frames, and basically what you're most comfortable with playing with. But just changing it, you shouldn't really just change a brand thinking it's going to do. There's two common mistakes: changing a brand because you think it'll improve your game, and changing a brand purely based off which player is using it, which professional player is using it.
Okay.
Because as I'll come on to a bit later, the professional players, their rackets are largely unrecognizable from the rackets you and I will play with. They're either they'll at the very least be customized to their individual specifications anyway.
Okay, that's really interesting. And like you say, we'll come back to that. But within, say, a brand, therefore, is it the more you pay, the more you get? And what's the difference between the higher price range and the lowest level?
The higher, that's basically the materials used in the makeup of the racket. So the more expensive frames will have more technology into them. They'll have better, better graphite. Well, most of them will be made of graphite and various other bits and pieces. The cheaper rackets may not be graphite; they may be more fiberglass or other materials, and they won't be as well made.
And
So
so,
if you're paying, to give you a broad idea, if you're paying anything upwards of £150 for a racket, whatever brand you're choosing, you're getting one of their better rackets. They're top end models. If you're paying sort of under, this is for full size rackets. Sorry, just to clarify, if you're
okay.
paying under, £100, they're regarded as cheaper rackets, and they will have cheaper materials, and they're more recreational rackets. They're not for not for the better players, if you see what I mean, because they won't
Yeah.
be as made. They won't have the same feel. They won't be as stiff or as powerful. They won't have all the extra attributes.
So that's interesting what you just said. I was going to ask you what's the difference between fiberglass and graphite then in terms of performance, and you said stiff versus.
It's basically that the better the racket, that it does vary. The trouble is, it is quite complex. Different different manufacturers. All the top end rackets will have a higher proportion of graphite in the racket. The more expensive the frame. Some may be blended with, some I use fiberglass as an example there. Some may be blended with other things as part of the latest, greatest technology they've introduced, other materials. For example, this dates me a little bit, but Head have had, to use Head, they've had various different technologies. They've had Intelligence series, Liquid Metals series, Flex Point. They've had Microgel, they've had UTech, they've had all these different technologies. The mold of the racket has stayed the same all the way through those, and it's been predominantly graphite, and then they've infused it with these other technologies. Now, some of it is marketing, some of them are improvements to the frames, and they will change the feel of the racket. So if you buy one Model X and then you buy its replacement 2 years later, if it's got a different technology, you might find it plays identically, or you might find it does play differently, even though it's the same mold racket. It's all at that point, it's all personal preference. So I've had that myself, where I used to use a particular racket by Head, Prestige, for years, loved it, and then they changed the makeup of it for one generation of the racket, and I didn't like that at all. So I stuck with the old. And then another 2 years later, when they brought out the next replacement, I much preferred that and went back to it.
Okay.
So, but in terms of the actual the mold of the racket, that didn't change. Just the layup, the materials they put inside it changed.
Okay, that leads me on to the next question, actually, that was asked by Valerie Brisden. I don't know whether you're on, was it Brisden? Valerie, if you're on the call, do feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to. But the question was, with more local shops closing, how can you get a demo racket these days? Because you're mentioning there that you tried this and tried that. Are you borrowing them from friends, or did you get them from
I get that question. I'm not going to lie, that question is difficult to answer, because it is a perennial problem with the lack of demos, and that is a little bit down to the closing. Like with everything, the closure of the many shops on the high street. It's also down to cost. The manufacturers don't necessarily, they used to quite often just give a shop, if they were buying X amount of rackets, they'd also give them one as a demo, so they could give it out to that shop, could use them for a demo program. Costs have gone up, manufacturing costs, so they don't necessarily give away a demo anymore. It has to be purchased by the shop, which obviously then is another decision the shop has to make about how much they want to stock. So what I will say, though, there are shops that do offer demo programs. There's quite a few. If you look for tennis specialist shops, and there are quite a few around the country. To give an example, there's Tennis Point, but there's Topspin Tennis. There's Wimbledon Park Sports in unsurprisingly Wimbledon. If you're around that area, look them up. They all offer demo programs. There's also Tennis Nuts. I don't think Pro Direct offer it. I could be wrong. But if you look at these, mail order demos are difficult, obviously. So finding someone that's local to you that you can go in and you can speak with the shop, and you can try, for example, like Topspin Tennis, who are sort of Norwich, Cambridge way. You can go in and sort of try out walk away with a couple of different demos, and you can go and use them for a week and try them, which is the only way to really do it.
Okay. Yeah, I guess some of the I know some of the brands have had demo days held at clubs as well occasionally.
Yeah,
the actual brand.
those are very good if you can go along to one of those. The only thing I would say, that's generally one brand. So it will just be, you'll be trying everything from that brand, which is great if you're after that brand. But it also doesn't necessarily give you a broad, you might like a Yonex X, Y, or Z. But it's good to try that with the Wilson, X, Y, and Z as well, and find which one suits you better.
And Anastasia's made a really good comment here. And Roshana, I noted your question. We'll come back to that. But Anastasia's just said, what should we actually be looking at when they're demoing? What should we be? Is it just what they like, or what feels comfortable?
Yes, yeah, pretty much. It's how they get on with the racket. So for children, sorry, Anastasia, I don't know how old your child is there, but it's a sort of, the weight is quite important, so that they find it too heavy, too light. And then yes, is it the right size for them, as I alluded to earlier? But then after that, it's down to personal preference. Do they like the feel of the racket when they're hitting the ball? Can they hit the shots? They got 9-year-olds, so it's making sure the racket is the correct size for them, that it's not too heavy, and that they can basically, that they're comfortable swinging swinging the racket and hitting the ball. Because some rackets, I've had that, you hit them and, for example, not wishing to sort of babble out Pure Drive, very, very popular racket used by, they've sold truckloads of them. I've played and string many of them for many different people. I can't get on with it. I don't like it myself. But that's just because it just doesn't feel right for my game.
Is that to do with it? Because I used to play with the babble out myself, and I used to find it quite head heavy, so that made it hard for me to volley. Is that still true, or is that old news?
No. The thing is, rackets. That was one of the main reasons I didn't like it. I just found it too stiff for me. I have to be careful of my shoulder in my old age. So I just found that babble outs would aggravate it. Nothing. They were lovely. They're very, very good rackets. Nothing wrong with them at all. But for me, they didn't. I couldn't get on with it. I preferred other frames.
So you're looking for a frame that will absorb
so something that's slightly, when you get to that sort of, when you try on those sort of rackets, it's then down to the stiffness and the flex of the racket, which is all published on that's a whole other minefield, probably not great for young children. That's probably yeah, that's not necessarily an issue for junior rackets and smaller children.
So Roshana is asking, she's got 9-year-old twins actually, and they've just moved to a 27-inch Wilson Blade and Wilson Ultra. Which other models or brands would you recommend to try for around the £100 mark?
Very good question. Those to start with are very good rackets. I would also try Head Radical, Head Extreme. Head Extreme is quite a spin orientated racket, so if they're looking to get a little bit more spin, that will help them. Babolat, I would. Well, Babolat, it's worth trying. That they are slightly stiffer, the Babolats. But if they get a Pure Aero Team, for example, that might not be. What was it? So yeah, there's quite a few choices around that, Mark. It's without seeing them play, it's a little tricky to sort of advise, but
probably something to sort of take that information back to their coach then and sort of work together with them perhaps. And so moving on a little bit, and once we've decided on our racket, if we buy it online or in a shop in the UK, it's going to come pre-strung. Is that right? I know in the States sometimes they're not. Should we
everywhere apart from the UK market, the rackets come unstrung.
Okay.
So for some reason, it was always required. Years ago, it was required rackets were strung in the UK, came strung, and it kind of stuck. I was given there was a retail reason for it, but it was a requirement. I would categorically always recommend anybody who's bought their racket and it's come with the factory strings in it to get it restrung immediately. The very first thing. factory stringing, it is generally very poor. And the other thing you've got to bear in mind is that it could have been strung in a factory en masse in China, which is one thing. But then you don't know, it might have been sat on the shelf for 6 months before you've purchased that racket. It
Is
might
that
have been
going to make a
sat.
big difference for, say, a mini red player, mini orange player?
For those, sorry, for those levels, those rackets are not designed to be restrung. They are they so the little basically up to about a 25-inch racket. So the ones I mean are those sort of aluminium cheaper rackets, not the ones that are like you can get 26-inch rackets, which are like the regular racket, just an inch shorter. They're proper graphite. They'll be about 90, £100. These
Okay.
rackets sort of I'm on about are the ones that are anything up to about £40 for juniors.
So I hope you cut the strings out of their racket there if they put the video on pause or set it.
Yes, sorry, should have clarified that.
That's okay. That's okay.
No,
But
those
so
rackets are
25
generally
inch
only.
upwards.
So anything, if anything, so to use Roshana's the Wilson blade and the Wilson Ultra there. If you haven't, if they've got the factory strings in, I would recommend those being restrung because those are actually very nice rackets and they will play much better with fresh strings in.
Okay, so let's move on to strings then, because we do want to get through these topics, and then we can perhaps take some more questions from the parents. Tell us more about the types of string, Hugh. What's on the market? There seems to be so much choice. What should a parent be considering?
Excuse me. So there are a few main categories of string. There is synthetic gut, which I would imagine everybody's heard of, which is sort of nothing wrong with it, sort of an entry level, fairly basic string, generally quite good all round, nothing special, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
You then have a multi-filament string, which is a very generally speaking, a man-made version of natural gut. It's not quite as nice as natural gut. But it is also a lot cheaper. And that's multiple, as the name suggests, multiple filaments woven together. You may well have seen it. It's the one that basically frays when it starts to break. And then the other main popular string range are polyesters, which are, excuse me, stiffer strings, generally designed to impart more spin on the ball. Generally meant for people with a higher swing speeds, generating more racket head speed. Very popular on the tour. And then over the top of all of those, you have natural gut, which is not cat gut, as many people may have thought. It's actually from cows intestine. But that is sort of the most expensive string and has been around for, well, pretty much since tennis rackets have been around in one form or another. So that is also used on tour, very rarely on its by itself in a full bed like it used to be in the 70s, 80s, early 90s. If it's used now, it will be with a hybrid in a hybrid stringing with another polyester.
Okay,
Instead.
so that leads me on to the next question, which is why would you use different types for the mains and the crosses? And I think mains is top to bottom, right? And then
correct, yeah. Crosses are So basically, if just to go back a step, the differences between those polyesters are stiffer strings. To clarify that, I would never recommend any child under the age of about, depending how big they are, under the age of about 14 uses a polyester. I wouldn't recommend it because they are stiffer strings. And up to, children are still growing. So polyesters can be quite jarring on the body, which can be quite bad for end up with injuries as they get older. If they're not regular string breakers, I would recommend a multi-filament or a synthetic gut, depending on their preference of the feel, because they will be, and particularly definitely if they're still hitting anything other than a yellow tennis ball, if they're hitting a green ball or an orange ball, they certainly shouldn't be using a polyester string. So just to give popular brand names, in case people hear their coaches talking about it, polyesters, famous ones are like Babolat RPM Blast, which is black, which is what Rafa Nadal uses. Luxolon Alupad Big Banger, it's generally called as well. They're the sort of general names that are thrown about. There's literally hundreds of other brands and makes as well, but those are the most popular. And I would, if no one else remembers anything from from this call, would recommend it. For youngsters, definitely under the age of 14, I would not recommend putting those sort of strings in their rackets. So
could you give brand names for the synthetic gut and the multi-filament?
So for multi-filament, very, very popular one, very good all-round multi-filament is Wilson Sensation. Generally, it's not that expensive. I charge, which is about £26 for a restring for that, for example. That's quite broad across the country. That's a general good all-round. It is actually, to a lot of pros actually use it. If they're lower level pros still use it with a hybrid if they can't afford natural gut. It's a very good all-round string. Another one is Babolat XL. That's a bit more expensive. Synthetic guts then still find very popular because the beauty of them is they come in several different colors because they're quite cheap to make and can be dyed quite easily without affecting the string's playability. So again, Babolat synthetic gut, Wilson synthetic power, I think it's called. They changed the name recently. All the brands do them, but that should be a lot cheaper restring. But the good news is if your child likes various different colors, which I know mine do, it's available in lots of different colors. Have hybrids of pink and blue and things like that. So
yeah, no, that's fun, isn't it? And
yeah.
So then, in terms of crosses versus mains,
So the reason players do that is so often the mains will have a more durable string in the mains, so the polyester, and then have a softer string like a multi-filament or a synthetic in the crosses. So what that sort of does is give you a best of both worlds kind of scenario. So you've got if it's also useful if you're finding your child is getting to the age of 14, they're snapping strings a bit more regularly, but they're still not fully grown. You could try them with a hybrid. So you could move, if they've been using a multi-filament, you could then put a polyester main string in with their existing multi-filament, and you might find that provides a little bit more durability on the string, but it also start to give them a little bit more spin on the ball.
So it helps you to sort of save a bit of money, perhaps in the longer
Yeah.
stringing, but doesn't quite go all the way to going to the top quality too soon.
Yeah.
And string can be bought on a roll as well as or an individual pack. So would you recommend if you go to a stringer, should you just say use your own string and I'll pay you, or should someone buy a roll?
You can do both. I mean, I have several clients who have their own reels because they know what string they like and they just buy it wherever they want to buy it, and then I just string it for them. I have others who like to try lots of different strings each time or don't really want to keep a reel, sorry. Having your own reel generally will work out. If you're snapping a lot of strings, it will work out more economical. But you've got to. But reels are a little bit more. Do have an initial upfront cost. They're more expensive.
They don't degrade in any way if they're sitting in the cupboard, though, if they're not used.
No, as long as like most things, as long as they're not, perhaps left in the boot of the car or in a damp garage or something like that, they'll generally be fine for a long time. The only one you have to really be careful with is natural gut, but that comes in a vacuum sealed pack. But if you only use half for a hybrid, that needs to be, you can't just put it back because it will dry out. you seal the bag back up. So,
Okay.
but other strings are generally, if you leave it for 20 years in the cupboard, it may not perform quite as well as it would have done when it was new, but most of them are generally okay.
And should you ever cut the strings out of your racket just because?
That's a very good question. All strings, a lot of I've always had these people come to me, the old boys, I used to call them at my old club, and they'd come with their big frying pan tennis rackets, and they'd had RPM Blast or another polyester put in their racket 3 years ago or something, and they bring it in saying, "Can you bet that it's not snapped in 3 years?" It's brilliant. The useful life of a polyester string is probably, broadly speaking, about 6 or 7 hours of play before it's generally what we would refer to as dead. And by dead, I mean it's all strings are about their elasticity. So once the elasticity is gone, they don't snap back. So you'll generally find your child will say, "Oh, my strings are just moving all over the place and they're not going back." That's generally when their elasticity is gone, which means even if they haven't snapped, they're past their useful life. So if they're not snapping back, they're not imparting any spin on the ball either. So basically, everyone's seen those sort of slow-mo videos at Wimbledon where you see the ball compress onto the strings, or the strings then snap back the other way. Once they start to lose that elasticity, they don't really do that bit very much or very well anymore, and you lose
Like a sort of
control.
catapult effect, which adds speed.
Yeah,
Okay.
and yes, exactly. But if you think about it like a trampoline, it's nice and taut to start with. Then over years, it basically just loses that sort of spring, and and then it doesn't really do anything. And that's what the strings what that results on the court to is loss of control. And also the other crucial thing to mention there, once the strings have gone dead and they've lost that elasticity is quite hard to say. They're also losing their shock absorption qualities. And there's only one place that shock from impact of the ball is going to go. It's going to go up to the arm. And so to go back to my point of those old boys coming in, so that the string's never snapped in 3 years. 9 times out of 10, they stood there in front of me with tennis elbow supports on, shoulder supports and things like this. And they would be much better off with a much softer string and just restringing more frequently.
That's really good advice then. So when you say 6 to 7 hours, you're talking singles play, quite a high level, presumably.
No,
Ah,
no, no. So pros generally, they will get their racket. A fresh restring will last them about a set of play at the level they're playing, because obviously it's fine margins there. Probably for the rest of us mere mortals, it would be fine for another several more sets. But for them, where everything's on the line, they can feel that if the string will have dropped off enough, it will have dropped enough tension that it's done. So the life of even if the life of like a polyester, for example, will only be several hours play. What you've got to bear in mind with that is that all rackets will lose tension the minute they come off the stringing machine.
okay.
So that's a fact of life. That can't be, better stringers can mitigate it, but that will happen. Certain strings are worse than others. So natural gut is the best because it'll have an initial drop and then it will plateau out. All other strings basically, when they come off, they'll come off the machine at a tension, and they'll basically just drop over a period of time like this until they've gone dead. And obviously that's whether you're hitting the ball or not. So even
Right.
if you just
So I'm seeing a big problem here because I have 2 rackets. I have my favorite one and my spare, and I don't think I've hit a ball with my spare probably for a year. So I need to go and get that restrung, and I haven't even used it.
Correct. So what I would always advise there is, if you've got a couple of rackets, I have this, players who have 5 or 6 rackets the same, or 3 or 4 rackets the same, that's a common thing that they'll do. They'll basically have 4 strung, and then they'll use one till it snaps, and then they'll get another one out. And they're like, but the new one feels different. And I was like, that's because you haven't hit a ball with it. What I always recommend is they rotate round those 3 or 4 rackets. So they'll use one for a practice, and they'll use the next one for the match, and then so on and so forth, because then they'll all wear out at roughly the same spot. But yes, you're absolutely right. Your racket that's not being used will have lost tension. Broadly speaking, it'll probably be fine if you go out and have a hit with it, but it won't feel like the other one.
Okay, so it makes sense to let them degrade at the same rate. And Andrew's asked a question, Andrew Pritchard. What is the useful life and hours of a multi-filament string?
That's a good question. It's better than polyester, which is why I would recommend for juniors and people who aren't snapping strings to have a multi-filament. We're probably talking, again, it's one of those things. There's lots of things that can accelerate the its useful life and reduce it. I'd probably say that's in sort of double-digit hours. If hitting, if you're playing for an hour, you probably get 10 or 12 good hits before that string's a little bit, but has degraded the tension. There'll be significant tension loss that you will need to get it restrung.
Okay. So let's talk a bit more about tension then, Hugh, if you don't mind. What tell us about, is it just personal preference? What's the impact of lowering and increasing the tension in strings, and how would a parent know what tension their child should have their racket strung at?
I'm very much a firm believer, the lower the tension, the better. Basically, again, using my analogy, think of it as a trampoline. The lower the tension, the more the trampoline effect comes into play. And it means more shock is absorbed. If you the higher tension, basically the stiffer that string bed is going to be. So if they're a junior player, I would say string low 50s, high 40s, low 50s pounds. If you're getting it strung relatively regularly, that's fine. But don't sort of go and try and string at sort of 60 pounds, because that will be, well, I'm not saying don't, but that will be a lot stiffer, and it will feel a lot stiffer, and they will get less power off the ball as a result, because it'll have less of a trampoline effect.
Okay,
Does that make sense?
Yeah, so you're talking about the speed. When you say power, are we talking speed? Is that the same thing, or?
No, the speed is the racket head speed.
Okay.
When I refer to, so the string bed will generate spin and power essentially, because that's what the strings are doing. But the racket coming through the shot is what's the racket head speed is what's generating the speed. Basically, lower tensions will give you more power. Higher tensions will give you more control. And what you should be looking for is the best balance of between those two parameters. And I would always err on the side of lower being better, because it will be more comfortable. Your arm will thank you.
Okay. And so if you're not creating very much power with your speed with your racket head,
Yeah.
counter that by having a different tension.
It wouldn't necessarily. If you're struggling to generate racket head speed, that would possibly mean the racket is too heavy for your game.
Okay.
So adjusting the strings won't necessarily increase racket head speed. The strings will have an effect on the power that you're hitting the shot, that you're applying to the shot, or the spin you're hitting with. Racket head speed will be down to how fast and that you're moving the racket through the air. So
Okay.
if you're struggling to generate a lot of racket head speed, there's lots of different. Again, without seeing a player, there could be a few things there. It could be the racket's too heavy for you, or something to do with the technique. But the strings wouldn't necessarily help with that.
Okay. I'm learning a lot here, and I hope everybody is too. We've got a couple more questions in the chat, but a question submitted in advance. Jessica Sebastian has asked, how do you know when the tension needs to be adjusted for your child? I guess we kind of covered that, but could you address that directly?
Um, if they're growing and there's, invariably they're starting to hit with more power, more spin, you may want to, and they're struggling to keep the ball in. Basically, they're now struggling. They're going through that transition where what was working before isn't working quite so well. If they're starting to hit the ball out a lot, I would perhaps adjust the tension a little bit. If they're struggling for power as they're coming up against bigger hitters, perhaps drop the tension a little bit so they get a bit of free, easy access to power without having to change anything else. Those would be my recommendations there. It's basically if they haven't changed anything game, they've just gotten bigger and they need and they're struggling to keep the ball in, then you might want to look at increasing the tension just to get that control back. But if they're also now not necessarily growing as quickly as their peers and they're struggling with the power, you might want to drop the tension down, and that gives them a little bit of free power.
I remember that phase actually, and I've forgotten about it, when a child goes from hitting the ball as hard as they possibly can and it always goes in, to suddenly it surprises them that it's going out because they've changed physically, and they need to start really thinking about the technique, but also possibly the tension in their racket and the size. Yeah. Okay, and then Roshana's come in with another question. At what age or level of game should we move to buying unstrung rackets?
Well, there's not many places that I know. Topspin tennis sell them unstrung. I think Wimbledon Park Sports do as well. At Tennis Point, sell them unstrung. Basically, that's more of a unstrung rackets. If you're buying an adult racket, so a 27-inch racket, and your child's playing a lot of tournaments, so you're spending upwards of £150 for a racket. Those are the rackets that you should be getting unstrung, and you should be putting in your preference of string, not just going with what the factory may have strung it with.
So when unstrung could mean just cutting the strings yourself.
Yes, I would. If you're buying say a Wilson Blade 98 or any racket that's sort of north of 150, a better racket basically. If it's got factory strings in, I would wholeheartedly recommend cutting them out and getting it restrung in your string of choice.
Okay. And Sarah's asked, does keeping rackets near heat or cold damage the strings? If you're popping
Short answer to that is yes, it does. A lot of people I know leave their rackets in the boot overnight, and that's bad for them. The up and down in temperature that can cause the strings to stretch, contract. I've had people who've done that, then they've gone to play the next day and the string has snapped in the bag overnight because it's affected the tension. So yes, ideally if you've got room, bring your racket bag in the evening and just try not to leave it near a radiator, or doesn't need to be anything more special than that, just not next to a radiator, or put it in the fridge.
Okay, great. Now there's been a few questions that were put in advance, but I think we've covered them all really, and we do need to move on because, believe it or not, we're already running out of time. Let's talk about grips, grip sizes, grip types, over grips, under grips. What should we think about there?
Well, for the little rackets to start with, very simple. They come in one grip size generally, so they're all grip 0. So up to adult rackets, they generally come in one grip size. So that's quite straightforward. When you get to 27-inch rackets, obviously you have the different grip sizes. Grip size is very important, because if you have it too big or too small, it can lead to tennis elbow or other injuries. So again, if you're going to a store and you're buying it, have them check the grip size for any good reputable store should know how to check the right grip size for you. In terms of different grip types, you have there's two. There's a replacement grip, which is the one that generally comes on the racket. That's the base grip. And then you have over grips, which are only designed really to go on top of that base grip. What that will do is make it fractionally bigger, only fractionally, but it would also mean over grips are generally much cheaper, designed to be replaced much more frequently. Whereas the base grip, they're quite a bit more expensive, but you don't need to replace them as often if you're using an over grip.
Okay, and in terms of the types of grip, because I know I've seen some that are more like a toweling sort of grip.
Yes. So again, that'll be personal preference. You can have you have, to give two classic examples, which is very popular. So you have torn grip, which is the blue one that everyone generally uses. That's for very sweaty hands, basically in very hot heat. So it's very absorbent. It's not great in a cold day in playing in the UK because it's very slippy at that point. And then you've got the other one, which is the white grip everyone refers to. There are other brands available, the Wilson Pro Over Grip, Roger Federer's grip, and hundreds of other players' grip. And that's a more tacky over grip, which is designed for players who don't sweat as much, but they want the grip on the racket. Generally, the reason a lot of grips are white, coincidentally, is because the white grip is generally the most tacky. So it's stickier. So.
Okay, interesting. So perhaps I can just shoot some really quick fire ones that you dampeners.
Literal personal preference. They are a misnomer. They don't absorb vibration. They don't. All they do is change the noise of the string beds. They take away the ping noise. So if you like the ping noise, or you don't like the ping noise, it's not going. Putting a dampener on is not going to stop tennis elbow.
Okay. What about if the butt comes off a racket?
They can be reapplied. So again, see a racket technician. Those can be restapled and reattached to the handle. That does happen quite often. So.
Okay, a racket that rattles.
Racket that rattles. What that will mean, it's probably got a little bit of when the grommets have been, the holes for the grommets have been drilled, the grommet strip that goes around the racket, the strings go through. Sometimes a bit of the graphite fibers can fall off into the side of the frame or the paint or whatever. That's quite easy to get out. Again, if you see a racket technician, they can remove the butt cap, and literally frames are generally hollow on the inside, so that'll just fall out. Or if you want to do it yourself, most butt caps of better rackets will have a little trap door that you can pop open with an awl, and then you just give it a little gentle bang on a table, and you'll probably find whatever's rattling will fall out.
Wow, I did not know about trapdoors in racket handles. That sounds dodgy as heck going through.
Well, that's how you can customize rackets and things.
Okay. Well, yeah. One more quick fire, and then we'll talk about customization. What about the implication of different string patterns? And I'm going to get super technical here, beyond my own understanding, but the open patterns and the denser patterns. What's that all about?
Very briefly on that. So the most popular ones are 16 by 19, which is generally regarded as an open pattern, and 18 by 20, 18 main strings with 20 cross strings, which is a more dense stringing pattern. Basically, the open pattern allows you to hit with a bit more spin, a bit more trajectory over the net, a higher ball flight. The denser the pattern means basically a much more true, flatter ball flight, but less spin. So a flatter shot. Less margin for error because it's just going flatter off the string bed rather than sort of looping a little bit more. After that, it's personal preference what you prefer. On the tour, it's a complete mixed bag of who uses what. So Djokovic uses an 18-19, used to use 18-20. Rafa, Federer used 16-19. Murray uses 16-19. Dominic Thiem. Sorry?
And the female players?
Female players rarely, to be fair, rarely use 18-20. They're generally more 16-19s. Not really sure why. There's no rhyme or reason to it. Perhaps they prefer a bit of the extra spin. 1619s are probably more popular across the board, but there are 1820s used to be, but now, you know, with players wanting to hit with more spin and more racket head speed and things, they like to have the extra kick. And polyesters obviously make a big difference because it allows them to control the spin a bit more.
Okay, and while we're on the subject, anything else we should be considering for female players differently from male players?
Generally, female players generally have slightly lighter rackets, but that not necessarily light. You know, that men will have heavier frames. But it's fairly similar, to be honest. That, you know, the tensions are generally the same. The types of strings they use, generally, you know, it's all the same principles apply. If they're still growing, then they shouldn't be onto polyesters. You know, they should have softer strings whilst they're growing, and when they're adults, you know, it's the same principles. I mean, they're using on the tour as well. Don't be you know, don't be taken in by what they're you know, what like Sam Raducanu is necessarily using on tour, because it isn't necessarily what you might think it is. You know, so you know, so yeah, the rules and the principles are still pretty much the same between the men's and the women's.
Okay, and about that customization question, then let's talk about that for a moment. In what ways do you customize rackets for the pro players, and in what ways are they not going to be the same racket as what we would buy in the store?
So in terms of customization, there's two main aspects. If you're buying two or three rackets, say for your player from a store, and you're buying two or three the same, you would expect them to be identical. Unfortunately, though, they're not. They won't be, because of manufacturing tolerances, and it can't be helped. So when they're, whichever brand it is, they're making hundreds of thousands of this particular model, they'll have a tolerance, a weight tolerance on the racket of roughly plus or minus 7 grams. Varies by brand, but that's roughly what it generally is across the board. What that could mean, if you've bought 3 rackets, you could have one that's bang on the published spec of, say, 300 grams. You could have one 7 grams under spec at 293 grams, and then you could have the third one 7 grams over spec at 307, which obviously is a very extreme situation. You'd be very unlucky to have bought 3 rackets and have that happen. But those would all have basically passed the tolerance test. However, all 3 rackets would end up playing quite differently, which is why you find quite often players who've got 2 or 3 rackets in their bag, they'll have a favorite that they'll always use. And like that, then they'll have the other 2 that they've had strung and they've never used because they keep going back to their favorite. What I do with customization is I take those tolerances away and make all 3 rackets identical by using lead tape. You know, I have equipment here that you can measure the balance point, the weight, the swing weight of the racket, and then I match them all to the same, so that player then knows that they've got 3 rackets identical. So they don't have a favorite. All 3 are their favorite. So that's just racket matching and making them the same. What you then do for what I do for pros, over and above that, is that they'll customize the frame for their own special requirements. So they'll take a frame and they'll say, well, I want it to be a bit more powerful. So how do I do that? So we put a bit of more weight in the head to sort of add that extra swing weight, add the extra power. Or they say, you know, I'm finding my rackets wobbling when I'm returning, you know, hard serve or something, or flutter as it's called. So you put some weight at 3 or 9 o'clock on the frame just to stabilize it a bit. Or I want the racket, I find, like you were saying, I find the racket too head heavy. I want to make it a bit more head light so it's easier to volley with. So you'll add some weight to the handle just to make it feel a little bit more whippy in the hand and a bit more easy to control. So these are all things that you know, that I'll generally then work with professional players to sort of find out what they want, what they're looking for, and then make the tweaks, and then you settle on the spec, and then you go back to making all the rackets the same for them. So that's generally how that element works.
That's incredible. I mean, you must be talking, what, top 100 players doing this, or lower down than that?
No, Well, definitely the top 100. They will all have their rackets at least matched and customized to their spec. But no, uh, any player playing professionally should be getting this done, because they'll have any player with multiple rackets of the same racket should have this done, and you will find that I've just done some this evening for a player, and he's bought 4 new rackets and had them customized to his own specs. And he plays on the tour. He's not necessarily winning Wimbledon at the moment, but it's still his tools. So he wants them exactly as he wants them.
And how many Hughes are there out there then? For people, whereabouts are you based? Remind us, Hugh.
I'm based in Buckinghamshire near High Wycombe, so just outside London. So there are a few of me dotted around the country, and providing similar services. It is more of a niche thing, to be honest. It's stringing is one thing. The customization is a little bit different, and there's various qualifications to take to do that with stringers and customizers as well. So yeah, there's not many, but there are a few. You can look them up, or if you do want to find someone nearer to you, by all means, ask me and I can put you in touch with someone. Or if you can't find someone, I can do mail order as well. But
Okay.
So yeah.
Fantastic. Well, Andrew's asked a quick question here as well. What would you say is a good Babolat equivalent for Wilson sensation?
So the equivalent for that from Babolat would be Babolat addiction. That's their sort of comparative multi-filament. Babolat do two. Well, Babolat do 2 multi-filaments: addiction, which is slightly cheaper, than an XL, which is more expensive and closer to Wilson's NXT.
Okay, and just a really couple of quick ones to finish with, because I realise we're almost over the hour now. But when you get a contract with a manufacturer, should you just go with what they supply, or is it worth having a different contract for strings and rackets and equipment and so forth? What do you say?
It depends on the manufacturer. If you get one of the big brands, their strings are every bit as good as each other's. So if you have a head contract, for example, head rackets are very good, head strings are very good. So are Yonex, with Yonex rackets, Yonex strings, Babolat, obviously, Wilson as well. So you should be able to find in their range, in their string range, something that will work for you. Like we just said there, Babolat addiction, Wilson sensation, reasonably interchangeable. There's very similar strings. So
great. And the final question, what about buying a stringing machine?
That's a good one. I remember there's 2 things there. There are some cheap stringing machines out there, some portable ones, which I think you highlight. That, if I'm brutally honest, I would really recommend against the portable variety of machine, because I've seen so many horror stories there where the racket has ended up cracked. The tensions are way off. If you want to string your own rackets, absolutely fine. I would recommend, though, going for paying a little bit more and getting a slightly better machine that's kept at home and done that way. But the portable ones are a bit they produce very variable results. I wouldn't recommend them. But what I would also recommend, if you are thinking of stringing your own, is to get yourself qualified and go on a proper course, to actually learn how to string correctly.
Okay.
Because what I would always say, it's not rocket science to string a racket, but it can be done very poorly if you don't know what you're doing. And what I can do ultimately is damage the racket, which is what no one wants.
Hugh, I can't think of anything else to ask you about rackets and stringings and grommets. The parents may be able to, and I'm going to leave the conversation open after we stop the recording here, so that parents can come off mute if they want to and ask any extra questions. But thank you so much. What an amazing knowledge you have. And I'm so happy to be able to bring you to an audience for whom this means so much. I know some people on here won't even play tennis themselves and will have found that quite overwhelming, but at the same time, they've now got the recording that they can listen back to, and the link for that will be published on the Tennis Parents community. Just a small advert before we say goodbye. The next Q&A that we're going to be doing is with Katie Swan, and the top GB player. And children are welcome to join that Zoom as well, although we do ask that adults supervise, and it's adults that register. And if you'd like to join that Q&A, it's on Sunday the 21st at 7 till 8 p.m. with the Tennis Parents community, and you can find the link to sign up for that on the group. But Hugh, once again, thank you so much. I'm going to leave the chat, leave the conversation open, but I'm going to stop the recording now and say thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
No problem at all. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome.